He wrote about her over 1,000 times. Her name. Her case. Her disappearance. Over. And over. And over again. For 35 years. That is not the behavior of an innocent man. That is the behavior of someone who cannot escape what he did. This is the story of Jonelle Matthews. And the monster who could not stop thinking about her. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Story Vault. This channel exists for one reason. To make sure stories like this one are never forgotten. If that means something to you, hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing. But for the people in these stories, it means everything. Now let's get into it. December 20th, 1984. Greeley, Colorado. A small, quiet town where neighbors knew each other by name. Where front doors were left unlocked. Where parents never worried about their children walking home alone because nothing bad ever happened in Greeley. That was what they believed. That was what made what happened next so devastating. Jonelle Matthews was 12 years old. Adopted by Jim and Gloria Matthews shortly after her birth, she had grown up in the warm embrace of a family that adored her. She was theatrical. Vibrant. The kind of child who lit up every room she walked into. She loved performing, loved making people smile, and on that cold December evening, she had just done exactly that. She had performed in her school holiday concert. Her parents had been there, watching her on that stage, beaming with pride the way parents do when they realize they have something truly special in their child. After the concert, Jim and Gloria stopped at a friend's house nearby. Jonelle headed home first. It was a short distance. A familiar route. A safe town. She walked through that front door at approximately 8:30 in the evening. She took off her shoes and placed them neatly by the Christmas tree. She answered a phone call. And then she was gone. When Jim and Gloria returned home that night, the house was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Jonelle's coat was there. Her shoes were there, still warm from her feet, sitting perfectly beside the Christmas tree like she had just stepped out for a moment and planned to come right back. But she was not in her room. She was not in the bathroom. She was not anywhere in that house. Jim and Gloria called her name. No answer. They searched the neighborhood. Nothing. By the time they called the police, something dark and heavy had already settled in Gloria's chest. A feeling that mothers get. A feeling that does not need evidence or explanation. A feeling that told her something was terribly, terribly wrong. Police arrived and began examining the scene. What they found outside the house stopped them cold. There were footprints in the snow outside the living room window. Someone had been standing there. Watching. But the footprints had been partially raked over. Deliberately disturbed. Someone had taken the time to drag something across the snow to destroy the evidence of their presence. That detail, the raked footprints, was immediately classified as holdback evidence. It was never released to the public. It was never mentioned in any press conference or news report. Only the killer knew about those footprints. Only the killer knew they had been raked. The police kept that secret for 35 years, quietly waiting for the day someone would say something they were never supposed to know. The investigation moved fast in those first days the way investigations do when a child goes missing. Every neighbor was questioned. Every family member examined. Early suspicion fell on Jim Matthews, the way it almost always falls on the father first. But he was cleared quickly. His alibi was solid. His grief was real. This was not a man who had harmed his daughter. Jonelle's biological mother was located and placed under surveillance. She too was found to be uninvolved. The community rallied around the Matthews family with the kind of fierce, desperate love that small towns produce when one of their own is taken. Vigils were held. Flyers were distributed. And in 1985, Jonelle's face appeared on milk cartons across the entire country, one of the early missing child awareness campaigns that would become a defining image of that era. A 12-year-old girl smiling from a milk carton on breakfast tables across America. And still, no answers. Months passed. Then years. The case grew cold in the way cold cases do, not because people stopped caring, but because the evidence had dried up completely. There was no DNA. No physical evidence. No witnesses. No body. In 1994, a decade after she vanished, Jonelle Matthews was legally declared dead. Her parents never stopped believing she was out there somewhere. But the law had moved on. And somewhere in that same town, the man who had taken her was living his life. Going to church. Greeting neighbors. Inserting himself into conversations about the case whenever he could. Calling police with cryptic claims of information. Writing about her obsessively in private documents that no one would see for decades. Over 1,000 documents. Her name written again and again by the hands that had ended her life. His name was Stephen Dana Pankey. He lived 2 miles from the Matthews family. He attended the same church, Sunny View Church of the Nazarene, the same church where Jim and Gloria Matthews found their faith and their community. But Pankey had been expelled from that church before the Matthews family ever joined. He hated that church with a specific, burning obsession. And when the Matthews family became prominent members of that congregation, that obsession transferred onto them. The day before Jonelle disappeared, December 19, 1984, Stephen Dana Pankey had been arrested. Not for anything connected to Jonelle. Not yet. He had been arrested for harassment and trespassing. One day before a 12-year-old girl vanished from her home 2 miles away. In the days immediately following Jonelle's disappearance, Pankey's behavior became erratic in ways that the people around him noticed but could not yet name. He made a sudden, unplanned trip to California. He consumed every piece of media coverage about the case with an intensity that went beyond curiosity. He began digging in his yard without any clear explanation. A car on his property mysteriously caught fire. And he called the police. Not to report something. Not to give them a lead. He called claiming he had received information through a pastoral confession, and he demanded full immunity before he would share anything. When they refused, he went silent. He did this more than once over the years. Getting close enough to the investigation to feel in control of it, then pulling back the moment accountability entered the conversation. This was not a man trying to help solve a case. This was a man who needed to know how close they were getting. By the time 2019 arrived, most people had accepted that Jonelle Matthews would never be found. 35 years is a long time. Evidence degrades. Memories fade. Cases like this one often end not with justice but with silence. But on July 23, 2019, everything changed. Workers on a farm in Weld County, just 15 miles from Greeley, made a discovery that stopped the world. Human remains. Wrapped carefully in a white bedsheet. Buried on that farm for 35 years. The remains were examined. Clothing was compared to what Jonelle had been wearing the night she disappeared from her home. It matched. The autopsy revealed a single gunshot wound to the head. She had been killed the very night she walked through that front door and placed her warm shoes beside the Christmas tree. She had never had a chance. And the detail that shook investigators most was this. Her hands had been found tucked under her armpits. A position that indicated she had been cold at the time of her death. A 12-year-old girl, cold and frightened, in the last moments of her life. The discovery of Jonelle's remains transformed the case instantly from a missing persons investigation into a confirmed murder investigation. And with a body now recovered, law enforcement went back to everything they had. Every statement. Every interview. Every strange phone call. Every cryptic document. And that is when the full weight of Stephen Dana Pankey's behavior came crashing down. Because buried inside over 1,000 documents he had written over 35 years were things he should never have known. Things only the killer would know. He had written about the raked footprints. The detail the police had never released. The detail that had been locked inside the investigation for 3.5 decades. He knew about them because he had been standing outside that living room window. He knew about them because he was the one who had raked them. Before we get into what happened next, drop a comment below and tell me, did you ever hear about Jonelle Matthews before today? And if this story has you locked in, make sure you like this video. It tells me you want more stories like this one and I will keep bringing them to you. We are not done yet. Because what happened inside that courtroom was just as shocking as everything that came before it. The arrest of Stephen Dana Pankey in 2020 sent shockwaves through Greeley. Not because people were surprised a killer had been found. But because of who he was. A neighbor. A churchgoer. A man who had attended vigils for Jonelle Matthews. A man who had shaken Jim Matthews by the hand and looked him in the eye and said nothing. A man who had sat across from investigators multiple times over 35 years, dancing around the truth, feeding them just enough to feel powerful without ever giving them what they needed. On October 12, 2020, Stephen Dana Pankey was indicted on charges of first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping. He was 71 years old. Jonelle Matthews had been 12. The first trial began in October 2021. From the very beginning it was clear this was not going to be a straightforward case. There was no DNA evidence connecting Pankey to Jonelle or to the farm where her remains were found. No fingerprints. No murder weapon. No forensic thread that tied him directly to her death in the way juries are conditioned to expect from crime dramas and television procedurals. What the prosecution had was something far more uncomfortable to prosecute. They had his words. They had his behavior. They had 35 years of a man who could not stop circling the thing he had done. The prosecution laid out everything. The arrest the day before Jonelle disappeared. The sudden trip to California immediately after. The obsessive media consumption. The mysterious fire. The digging in the yard. The phone calls to police demanding immunity. The 1,000 documents. And most damning of all, his knowledge of the raked footprints, the detail that had never been made public, the detail that lived only in police files and in the memory of the man who had stood outside that window on a cold December night in 1984. Pankey's defense did not deny that their client was difficult. They did not attempt to paint him as a pleasant man or a misunderstood one. They simply said he was a jerk. Not a killer. Just a jerk. A strange, obsessive, deeply unpleasant man who had inserted himself into a case that had nothing to do with him for reasons that were unhealthy but not criminal. And the jury could not agree. After days of deliberation, they deadlocked on the murder and kidnapping charges. A mistrial was declared. The only conviction that came out of that first trial was a misdemeanor charge for making false statements to police. A misdemeanor. For the man who had taken a 12-year-old girl from her home on Christmas Eve and buried her in a field for 35 years. Jim and Gloria Matthews sat in that courtroom and watched a mistrial get declared and walked out into the cold air with nothing. Again. But the prosecution was not finished. They went back. They rebuilt. They searched for what had been missing the first time around. And they found Patrick Collis. Collis was a fellow inmate who had shared space with Pankey during his time in custody. And what Pankey had said to him inside those walls was the kind of thing that changes everything. According to Collis, Pankey had looked at him one day and said words that no innocent man would ever say. "She was dead before I crossed the railroad tracks." Just like that. Casual. Matter of fact. Like it had been sitting inside him for so long that it had stopped feeling like a confession and started feeling like just another thought. "She was dead before I crossed the railroad tracks." Those 8 words became the spine of the second trial. The second trial began in October 2022. This time the prosecution walked in with everything they had before plus the testimony of Patrick Collis plus a deeper, more forensic examination of the thousands of documents Pankey had written over the decades. Because buried inside those documents were more things he should never have known. More details that had never been released. More evidence of a man whose guilt had been slowly eating him alive from the inside for 35 years. Leaking out through the pages of documents he compulsively wrote in the middle of the night when the weight of what he had done became too heavy to carry in silence. He had written about burying bodies in Colorado. He had described himself as the subject of a capital murder investigation long before he was ever officially named a suspect. He had written about his fear of the death penalty if he revealed where the body was located. A man who knew nothing would have no reason to write any of those things. A man who knew everything would not be able to stop himself from writing all of them. Pankey took the stand in his own defense. It was a decision that stunned many legal observers. Taking the stand as a defendant is always a risk. Taking the stand when you have 35 years of contradictory, self-incriminating behavior to account for is something else entirely. He admitted to lying. Not about the murder. About other things. Many things. He acknowledged that he had not always told the truth to investigators. He acknowledged that his behavior had been strange and obsessive. He acknowledged that he was not a good man in many respects. But he denied killing Jonelle Matthews. He sat in that witness box, an old man by now, and looked at the jury and denied it. The jury did not believe him. On October 31, 2022, 38 years after a 12-year-old girl placed her warm shoes beside a Christmas tree and answered a phone call and vanished, Stephen Dana Pankey was convicted of felony murder, second-degree kidnapping and false reporting. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 20 years. Given his age at sentencing, parole eligibility would not arrive until he was 91 years old. For all practical purposes, Stephen Dana Pankey would die in prison. Jim Matthews stood outside that courtroom after the verdict and spoke about forgiveness. Not because what had been done to his daughter was forgivable. But because he had carried the weight of that December night for 38 years and he needed to put it down. Gloria Matthews did not speak of forgiveness. Some wounds do not work that way. Some mothers cannot forgive the man who took their child's warm shoes from beside a Christmas tree and turned them into a memorial. Both of them were right. Grief does not follow a single path and neither does justice. Jonelle Matthews was 12 years old. She had performed in a school concert that evening. She had made people smile the way she always did. She had walked home through a town she believed was safe, through a door she believed was hers, into a life she believed had a future. She placed her shoes neatly by the Christmas tree. She answered the phone. And then a man who lived 2 miles away, who hated the church her family attended, who had been arrested the day before for harassment and trespassing, took everything from her. He took 35 years from her parents. He took decades of birthdays and graduations and ordinary Tuesdays and holiday concerts from a family that had loved her completely. And then he spent those 35 years writing her name over and over again in private documents, calling police with cryptic claims, attending community vigils, running for public office, living his life in the same town where everyone was still grieving. Until 8 words spoken casually to a fellow inmate finally closed the door on all of it. She was dead before I crossed the railroad tracks. Jonelle Matthews is no longer a missing face on a milk carton. She is a daughter who was found. A victim whose name now carries a verdict attached to it. A 12-year-old girl who walked home from a school concert on December 20, 1984, and whose story the world now knows in full. She deserved so much more than what she got. But she deserved this too. She deserved to be found. She deserved to be remembered. And she deserved to see the man who took everything from her spend the rest of his life behind bars. Justice was 35 years late. But it came. That is the story of Jonelle Matthews. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, leave a comment below and tell me what hit you hardest. This community exists because of you, and every comment, every like, every share keeps these stories alive and keeps this channel going. If you are new here and this is the first story you have watched on the Story Vault, welcome. There are many more where this came from. Subscribe so you never miss one. Every single story on this channel is told for the people who can no longer tell it themselves. I will see you in the next one.